So quick introduction, I'm Wes Wineberg. I'm a member of Synack's R&D team. Synack is a company that leverages the best combination of humans and technology to discover security vulnerabilities. Basically, we do crowdsourced security testing, so if you like security testing, you should check us out. And if you happen to need a company security tested, I mean, we do that kind of thing too. Some background on myself. I used to work for a company called WorldTech. They did SCADA, smart grid, medical device hacking. So devices, I guess, that were a lot more critical than Internet of Things devices generally. But a lot of the same techniques. They got acquired by GE. And then about a year ago, I joined Synack as a member of their research and development team. So before I start, I just want to make sure that I give special thanks out to my coworker, Colby Moore. He's giving a talk here at DEF CON on hacking satellites, so you guys should check that out too. But the testing that I did for these 14 devices, I split it up initially with Colby, so I did 7 of the devices and he did 7 of the devices. I further did some testing to make this presentation, but definitely need to give him credit for the work that he did. So a quick outline. Basically, I'm going to cover 2 different things in this talk. The first is kind of how we decided to test the devices, what our techniques were, what our strategy was. I'm not going to spend a ton of time going through that. I think there's been some other talks, and I think there's going to be some other talks more around techniques and tools that you can use. But I want to at least give an overview of what we did, what we put in place. And then I want to spend the majority of the time going through the 14 devices that I looked at. We've got, 45 minutes to get through 14 devices, so it doesn't leave us a ton of time for each one. And there's probably a million things I could say for each of them, but I've tried to condense it down to the most interesting points. So that's going to be the plan here. So we're going to start with testing techniques and really testing goals that we had. I tried to find some clip art of a data chisel, but Google could find me nothing. I was a little bit disappointed. So our starting goal is to figure out what do we want to get out of testing these devices. And when it comes to, I guess, an attacker's perspective, that's really what we want to consider. A company that's making one of these devices, their only real concern when it comes to security is what's someone likely to try and do to their device that's going to make them look bad or make their customers unhappy. They generally aren't going to care a lot about security beyond that because it's never going to directly impact them. So McAfee predicts that attacks are going to ramp up on the Internet of Things. And I generally would only sarcastically quote threat predictions, but I think it's pretty accurate and actually coming true for a lot of embedded devices. You see botnets of home routers and that type of things. And a lot of these Internet of Things devices are going to be very similar in attack surface. So then thinking like an attacker, we've got kind of 3 different ways of accessing an Internet of Things device. We've got direct physical access, where you pretty much have to have the device in your hands. We've got local network access, which for a lot of these devices just means you got to hop on the same Wi-Fi network that the device is connected to. But basically, I guess, non-routable traffic that you can get to the device. And then the third way to get to these devices is remotely. So from the internet, what can you do to this device potentially? And so from an attacker's perspective, physical is less valuable than local network, which is less valuable than over the internet, almost entirely because of the scale of things. I, as an attacker, might be great at, hacking devices, but if I have to go around to each of your houses to hack your device, that's not going to get me very many results. And, a lot of risk behind that. Local network is primarily you're just going to be concerned about people doing it for fun. Is your neighbor going to be messing with your Internet of Things devices? Whereas remotely is really what an attacker's likely to be after. Can they turn your device into a botnet? Can they crash every single camera out there? Things with real scale is what attackers are going to be really interested in. And so with that in mind, we kind of defined a set of goals of we don't just want to test any one of these devices as an individual device. We want to look at its whole ecosystem. So we want to see what is there for the hardware, but also what works with that. Is there PC applications that you use to configure or to control this device? Does it have mobile applications associated with it? What kind of access do they have? And then finally, cloud communications. Does the device connect to the cloud? Does the mobile application connect to the cloud? Consider that perspective as well. We felt that if we only really looked at one of these or a few of these, we'd be kind of missing the point. Attackers aren't necessarily going to limit themselves, so we didn't want to limit ourselves either. So when we came to testing each of these, our goal with hardware testing was really to try and root the device as quickly as possible, to turn it from a complete black box perspective of the device to more of a gray box test where we can kind of see what binaries are running on it, see what services are open, maybe look at config files. Basically just make it easier for us to attack one device and then scale that to a lot of devices. From the PC side of things, we're kind of looking at, are these going to be easy targets for an attacker? Do they have any sort of special privileges, any special trust between a PC application and the device itself, maybe between the cloud services? And then thinking like an attacker, if there's a PC application that everyone's installing, maybe to control your webcam or something, and that application is filled with vulnerabilities, malware authors are already really good at writing malware for PCs. So if there's any way they can leverage that, we wanted to find that out. For mobile applications, when we looked at them, they're really kind of a black box to the user. You install a mobile application, you don't have much choice. The vendor is going to give you, your camera control application or your thermostat control application, and it might request permissions, and you basically decide, well, do I want to use this mobile app? So pretty much every user is going to say yes, but they don't really know what's happening behind the scenes. So we wanted to look at that a bit. And we definitely wanted to focus on how does that mobile application communicate out? Is it doing that in a secure manner? As well as does that mobile application have any special privileges or more access to your mobile device than it should? The last area is cloud communications. And for these, we wanted to look at how are they authenticated? How does it know that your camera is a legit camera and you're the owner of it and you should have access to it? Are those communications encrypted if they're authenticated? And then who stores the data? Where's the data stored? Basically, we wanted to look at who ultimately controls your device. Is it something that you alone control? Is it kind of a mix between you and the cloud systems? Or is everything in the cloud and you're at their mercy? So the final goal was to do our testing quickly. We had 14 devices and we didn't have lots of time. So normally when I'm testing devices, it really bothers me to kind of just get started on testing a device, just know that it's full of vulnerabilities and then be out of time. But at the same time, companies have limited budgets. I've got lots of other work projects that I need to get done. So we split it up between me and my coworker, and we really aim to spend 2 days maybe testing each device, have it all kind of wrapped up in a month. Probably ended up being more like 4 or 5 days per device. But we still wanted the results to be of value. So really what we decided to do is target, hey, if your average InfoSec professional grabs this device and decides to spend a week on it, what are they going to find? Are they going to find absolutely nothing, or is it just going to be vulnerabilities left, right, and center? And for most of these devices, a week was more than enough time to have some good results. And had to include a quote from Cave Johnson. It's where I get all my business advice. So a bit on the techniques for each of the areas that we used. Hardware testing, was done exclusively in ISO Class 5 cleanroom facilities, as you can see pictured here. In actual practice, our testing was quite organized, but when you've got 14 devices and test equipment, things get a bit scattered. But I think the main thing from the hardware perspective is that very little specialized tools were needed. Well, maybe that's the wrong way to put it. Expensive equipment wasn't needed to test these devices. Your standard hardware testing equipment, the standard hardware stuff that you would have if you're just developing embedded devices, if, for lack of a better example, you play with Arduinos, you probably got everything you need to test these devices. Multimeter, serial cable. That's more or less it to get a good start. So we did have some tools, but we didn't really have to go out and get anything special to do all the testing that we did. And while I'm on hardware, a little bit of a spoiler for what you'll see coming up, but serial cable was really all we needed for 12 of these 14 devices to root them. There was serial consoles everywhere. I've tested a lot of different hardware devices kind of across the board, and usually serial consoles are pretty common. Sometimes they're locked down, sometimes they're not. But usually it's like maybe half of devices that you look at will have one. So 12 out of 14 was a little bit more than I expected. Kind of funny to see. So for PC applications, I kind of mentioned our goals, and the way that we're going to cover those is we're going to monitor communications, basically man in the middle all communications from that application. We're going to determine if the device trusts the PC application, and we're going to determine if the cloud trusts the PC application, and basically how does it establish that trust? Is it done based on user-supplied credentials? Is it done based on magic values? Kind of how is that set up? We also wanted to look at how the PC application then stores its configuration. If it's got your credentials, does it just store them in a text file on your desktop, or how does it properly store your data? How does it do device backups, for example? Basically, any data that it collects, what does it do with it? And then we just wanted to look for general software bad practices. Basically, is this an application that you shouldn't install on your computer, should be flagged as malware kind of thing? For mobile applications, a bit of a similar approach. We wanted to look at communications as one of our primary focuses. So the way that you do that, I'm sure there's lots of talks on, but generally speaking, you want to man in the middle of communications. For web communications, you probably want to send them through a web proxy. So on iOS, you can set up maybe HTTPS certificates so that you can man in the middle of those communications. You can configure Wi-Fi to point everything to a proxy, and a similar setup on Android as well. We then wanted to decompile the applications, look for various secrets, whether those were API keys, magic values, what have you. We wanted to determine how the cloud trusted the mobile application. And we wanted to look at, once again, how configuration data is stored, how backups are performed, etc. Phones are generally at less risk of having malware installed on them, but we still wanted to see some best practices regarding mobile applications. So kind of the OWASP top 10 for mobile is the kind of things that we were looking at. And then finally, for cloud communications, really we wanted to look at authentication, and we wanted to look at general security and encryption. We wanted to see if there was a special set of communications that the mobile app would use compared to your device. Just kind of get an idea of what gets communicated out to the internet and back. And one of the interesting areas that we wanted to focus on is how is a device initially registered. So you go to Best Buy, you buy a camera. How does their cloud system know to trust that camera? Does it have a unique secret? Is it a static secret? Is there just no secrets? Kind of how that was set up. On the downside, since we just went out to the store and bought a whole bunch of devices, we didn't have written permission from any of these companies to go ahead and hack all their stuff. So from a hardware perspective and a software perspective, that's fine. We don't need to ask them necessarily. But when it comes to their web servers, you're looking at criminal charges for pen testing their server without permission. So we had to be very careful that we were really only looking passively and really only using the applications as intended. but it was a bit disappointing because in addition to looking at hardware, I've looked at a lot of web applications, and a lot of the stuff I was seeing, just red flags everywhere in terms of this is probably not done properly, but we had to draw the line. All right, so that's more or less all I have to say on techniques and goals. I'm going to jump right into the results. So we had 14 different devices, and I kind of split them up into 3 categories: cameras, home automation, and thermostats. The Nest Protect's not really a thermostat, but it's close enough. And so our goal with the devices that we chose was we wanted to kind of try and pick what some of the industry or market leading devices were. This is a little bit difficult to do for Internet of Things because every company, you look up their device description and it's the market leader. But that can only probably be true for one of them. So we did a mix of what devices have already kind of sold really well and a lot of people have them. And then we also tried to pick some devices that looked like they'd be the up and coming market leaders potentially. So I don't know if we got that exactly right. I'm sure people have their whole business job to figure out that, but this was kind of the group of them that we came up with. So the first device I have results for is the D-Link DCS2132L. So this is a camera. I don't have a picture of it here because I figured I don't need to have more than 100 slides. And so this is a camera that I believe is just wired, no wireless. It has, maybe it's wireless. The main findings that we had on this was that it has a proprietary UDP protocol that it uses to handle all its communications. And this is a custom protocol, but it's also a protocol that just transmits all its data in clear text. It has some hashes set on the messages it sends to do authentication, but technically there's nothing stopping someone from man-in-the-middling all those communications and replaying messages and other issues. For a lot of these devices, we, instead of just blindly testing them, we went out and looked at what past research has been done. And so for this device, several other people have already investigated different aspects of it. And so for that UDP protocol, there's a great write-up online of someone who reverse engineered the whole protocol. They did that by looking at the PC application, looking at all its commands, and then getting an understanding of how it was set up. And what they basically discovered is that the hashing mechanism used to authenticate the messages can be used against the device to actually retrieve the password from the device that it uses for authentication. You can then send a custom command that says, hey, execute a program for me. So you have to have the password, which you first retrieved by abusing the hashes, and then it will basically let you execute any command you want. So that was a vulnerability that we found that was already out there. It had been out for about a year. The management interface of this device uses plain HTTP. It was kind of weird. This device has both HTTP and HTTPS ports open, but when you hit the HTTP port, it doesn't redirect you. It just says, all right, we're going to do HTTP. So conceivably, most users would never even hit the secured interface. And that management interface can be used to configure the camera as well as to actually view the camera feed. So it's quite likely that a lot of users would use it in that way. So this device had a PC application that you could use as well to configure it. And it had a function where you could back up the configuration and settings from the device. We found that when we did that, it basically stored it to a text file in the device's directory. And it was a clear text file of all the configuration, including the passwords in plain text. So if users, I guess, weren't aware of this, it's quite possible that they've just got a file sitting around with whatever they've defined as their camera password on it. Probably more of a risk is that this application checks for updates to see if there's a new version of the application, new software out, etc. And it does that by hitting a plain HTTP URL, checking if it says there's an update, and then downloading whatever update's specified and basically installing it. So if someone is running this application on a laptop on an unsecured Wi-Fi point, for example, it'd be very easy for an attacker to man in the middle their connection and say, oh yeah, I have an update for you, go download this binary. So basically having this application with the auto update feature puts your computer at a lot of risk. And like I mentioned, the kind of side benefit of this application from the other perspective is that it can be decompiled to figure out the UDP protocol info. So there's also a mobile application that works with this device. Once you log in to your camera through this application, your login will never time out. So if you actually restart your phone or close the application, then you're fine. But if you let your friend borrow your phone, they can just open this app and it'll be good to go. The application does use HTTPS to talk to the MyD-Link servers. And these servers then basically provide the credentials and connection information for how to get to your camera. And by default, your camera will be set up to only go over plain HTTP. So conceivably, you can configure it to be more secure, but by default, you're going to be using an HTTP connection from this app. There's no certificate pinning for the connection to MyD-Link. And I've got this noted wherever it's the case on mobile applications. It's not a huge risk, but some vendors pin their certificates so that people can't, get infected on their jailbroken devices easily, or non-jailbroken even, I guess. So it's a small risk, but it's there. And then one of the MyD-Link websites still uses plain HTTP, so this one was less critical, but an attacker still might be able to influence certain things. And so finally, the D-Link cloud can be used to store camera data, but users can also connect directly to their camera without using the D-Link cloud. So for this device, you kind of had both options. You could make some use of the cloud functionality, or you could ignore it and just go direct. So as I suspected, this picture is way too small for anyone to see. But basically, the person that reverse engineered this protocol and found the vulnerability went as far as making a Metasploit plugin for that. And so basically, the first option the Metasploit plugin you can run is retrieve me the password hash. So we'll give you a hashed password. I think it's an MD5 though, so chances are pretty good you're going to be able to crack it. So that's what I have showing here. And then once you have the password, then you can tell it to execute a command. So in this window, I'm basically telling it, hey, execute the command touch temp/touched. Basically create a file in the temp folder so I know if it's run. And then from my own SSH session to the device, I logged in and checked, and sure enough, the file called touch was created as soon as I ran that command. So what was interesting with all of this is I saw this and I thought, okay, that's not good. But our camera is, like we got it from the store, a fairly old version, which is kind of a problem for a lot of Internet of Things devices. It's up to the user to install updates. So I'll download the latest update, came out, 6 months ago. We'll be fine. So that's what I did. And then I reran through all this code, and it actually still works just fine. So as of yet, there's no patch from D-Link for this vulnerability. If you or anyone you know has this camera, they're vulnerable to this. So next I have how to get a serial console, and I basically got a slide on this for every device I looked at. My thoughts being, I've only spent a few days testing these devices. If any of you guys are interested or already have one of these devices, I'd be more than happy for people to take it further, test these devices further, find some additional exciting vulnerabilities, and really having access to the file system is kind of the first step you're going to need for that. So for this device, you can basically wire out a serial connector here. I'm going to post all the slides later so you can zoom in and it'll look nice. But basically there's a serial connector right on the board. You just hold down the enter key while the device is booting and you'll drop to a U-boot prompt. From there you can modify the boot arguments is basically the strategy. You can then boot directly to a shell, change the root password to something new, reboot the device, and instead of booting to a shell, just have it boot to the normal init scripts. From doing that, we were able to extract the root password hash and crack it and determine it to be this value. Since that time, someone else already did the same thing, so you can also just find this online. I've listed out the FCC ID for all these devices as well. Some devices are going to have different hardware revisions over time. Conceivably, they're required to have a new FCC ID when that's the case. So if you're looking at my slides in a month and you're like, this doesn't make sense at all, it's a good thing to check. And so here's basically the commands that we ran. to change the boot arguments to run basically a shell as the init script instead of the normal init scripts, and then to tell the device to continue booting. So you can take those two commands, copy them, paste them into your U-boot shell, and you'll drop to a shell prompt, which is what we've got here. The one thing to note on this device is that it's got a watchdog function that still runs even though we're not running the normal init scripts, and it kicks off after about a minute, so you're going to want to look at the password or change it quickly, or if you really want, just fire the watchdog properly so it doesn't reboot. All right, so the next device that we looked at was the DROPCAM Pro. This device was something that my coworkers had actually looked at last year and did a presentation on at DEF CON last year. So we were mostly looking at, is there anything new that we're going to find in a few days? And we wanted to make sure we continued to focus on the mobile and PC applications as well. So more or less what we found is not much had changed. This device is built on top of the Umbrella dev kit, which another device that we look at here also was. That dev kit has some interesting functions, but overall seems to at least have considered security. So it's a good enough starting point, I guess. This device does have an exposed serial port, but generally was found to be quite secure. For the PC applications, there was older versions of it which were vulnerable to DLL hijacking. This was something that my coworkers had found, but we were waiting on DROPCAM to fix before they could talk about it, so they didn't have that presented last year at DEF CON. But basically, the application could put a user at some risk of malware getting on there, injecting a DLL, and then running with all the permissions and access that this application would have. That's since been fixed. On the OS X binaries, instead of downloading the Mac software from the internet, the camera itself acts as a USB drive if you plug it into your computer, and you can run the binaries to run the setup scripts. They found that these have rewrite execute permissions, so malware could conceivably, or if you're buying a used camera or what have you, someone could easily rewrite that binary to something else, and a user would know the difference. That vulnerability I don't believe has been fixed yet. When we were testing these devices a few months ago, it was still a problem. For the mobile application, the login credentials are stored in the keychain, which is generally a good place to store them. Although if you have a jailbroken device, also a very easy and obvious target for malware. There's no SSL cert pinning, but that's just a risk that companies can choose to take or not take. And communications were all done properly over SSL. So certificates were validated even though they weren't pinned. DROPCAM has an interesting setup where video is only stored in the cloud. There's no local recording. So you need to make use of their cloud services if you want storage of the video. And the communications to the cloud, once again, on the device, on the mobile, certificates were checked properly. So we didn't find a ton of new stuff there. We weren't too surprised by that because my coworkers had spent like a month on it before, so spending a few more days, we mostly just had time to look at what was new. And so here's basically the summary of how to get a serial console if you want to explore the DROPCAM yourself more. You're going to basically want to drop to a AM boot shell, modify the boot arguments, boot to that shell, change the root password, and then reboot the device normally. The serial console for this one didn't have a nice set of pins, but it's not too hard to wire up an adapter. And so basically, here's the two commands you're going to want to run once you're in the AM boot shell. Something to note is that the first command makes changes persistently. In U-boot, when you change the boot arguments, they don't persist generally. But for this one, they do. So you can run the show PTB command to see what your original boot string was instead of just blindly overwriting it, so that you can make a copy of it, change it back so the device can boot normally after you're done accessing the file system. So the next camera that we looked at was the FOSCAM FI9826W. We looked at this one not necessarily because it was the industry leader, but because it's been around a while and people have hacked it like no tomorrow. So this camera also has the fun feature where it can like rotate and pivot to really see a whole room. So this device has, like I said, had a long history of people hacking it. By default, it uses plain text communications. They secured this by going over port 88 instead of port 80. And people have kind of looked up how they do backups and firmware updates, and both of which get encrypted to a static key. So you can potentially dump that key out of the firmware, and then if you get access to someone's backup of this device, you can decrypt that and get access to all the configuration data, passwords, etc. Since they do have a history of people hacking them, they've got like 6 different little inserts in the box that tell you should use it securely and change your passwords. And they do actually even require you to set a password when you're first setting up the device so that you can't just continue to use the defaults. So that's good to see. But as our testing showed, there was still a lot of other issues that remained. For the PC application, the version that we had used an ActiveX control to load up the camera view, or you had the option of downloading a separate application altogether and it could tie in instead. We later on did a firmware update on this device, and then instead of an ActiveX control, which I guess they started to have trouble with people running, like I could not even make it work after I turned off all the security warnings, they've just got a regular binary that you run, which I imagine has a lot of the same functionality as their ActiveX control did. So for their mobile application, they stored credentials in the keychain. They didn't have cert pinning, and how it communicated would depend on how you configured the camera. You could tell it to communicate over a secure port, or you could tell it to communicate over the default, which is plain text. We also found various hard-coded API keys in their mobile application. My notes aren't working great on my presentation, but I believe it was API keys to their service as well as to some other services as well, like Twitter or what have you. They don't actually have a cloud solution at all. So instead, you can put a SD card into the device and record to that. Otherwise, you can record data on the device, and I think it gets erased after you reboot the device. So you got those 2 options, or you can just tie into their stream and record that however you choose. So this text is small, but maybe you'll be able to see it. But basically, I dropped to the serial bootloader here and watched the device boot up. And part of the text that scrolled past was some text that included this. And I thought, that's interesting. And basically, it's just the output of them running a bash script, running a bunch of commands. And it basically says, changing password for FTP user 1, new password. And then it says, bad password, too short, retype password. And then it says, password changed by root. So I saw this and I just really quickly skimmed over it in my mind. And I thought, I bet this user has like a bad password. That's what Linux is trying to tell me. So I tried all like the defaults, like, FTP user 1 / root, FTP user 1 / password. And I don't really want to admit it, but I spent like half an hour looking through stuff, going through their file system, looking at their init scripts, and everything I looked at said like, this script runs, it takes an argument, changes the password. But everywhere I looked, there was no arguments being passed in. And so then finally the light bulb went off in my mind. Oh, they are just passing in no password. And I tried with no password, and then it immediately dropped me to a shell right here. And it had a message that said, you are welcomed by FOSCAM R&D. So at least they welcomed me once I finally realized that there was no password. And so this was great to see, because even in the latest version of their firmware, this will get you right to a root shell if you don't want to go through U-boot first. This is only over the serial line, but still funny to see. So once we got access to the serial console, I dumped out the password hash for the old version of the firmware and for the new version of the firmware. It's different in both cases. I didn't immediately find any reference to these online, so I'm not sure that anyone else has cracked them yet. So you guys can, if anyone wants to, take these, crack them. I'd be pleased. You don't have to, because these are really only used for the serial console. you could just change these to something new, but it might be interesting to see what they use for the password. It would be great if like the whole FOSCAM R&D team uses this for everything. Companies never do that though, so it's probably not an issue. Sure. The other interesting thing is that old versions of their firmware, people just looked in the firmware, found the OpenSSL command they use to encrypt and decrypt the firmware images when they're doing an update. And so those you can find online. For the newest version of firmware, someone basically just said, oh, no one knows what the new decryption thing is. So I thought to myself, well, what's stopping me from knowing? I'll go take a look. And what I found is basically instead of just running the OpenSSL command, they build up a string of hex bytes, which is right here, and then they pass them to a library that they wrote called reform string. Since I had no time to test in these devices, I spent like 20 minutes on it, was angry that I couldn't figure it out. It's just some really simple byte swapping within the string to transform it back to the OpenSSL command. That'll just have the key there. So if I get some free time later on, I'll just do it myself. Otherwise, this is the function if anyone else wants to take a stab at it. So to get a serial console on this device, pretty straightforward. Like a lot of other devices, you modify the U-boot arguments, boot to a shell, or don't even bother, just log in using FTP user 1 and a blank password. And I've kind of got a picture of that there. The next device we looked at was the, I don't know how you say this, CLOSELI SIMPLICAM? I'll just call it the SIMPLICAM. This device, like the DROPCAM, is built on the Umbrella dev kit. It uses HTTPS for all its communications, but there was no verification of the certificates used, so you could pass it any self-signed cert you want, and it would happily accept that. So HTTPS was providing no additional security. We reported this to them a couple months ago, and they claimed that it's now fixed, and I got a little bit more on that later. So supposedly that's good. We just heard back from them last week, so I haven't had a chance to confirm or deny, but they say it's fixed. So I'm presenting it here. Once you get a shell on the device, if you need the root password, instead of trying to crack it, you can just look in their config file, and they've got it referenced there. So that was fun to see. Firmware updates are encrypted, and I got a little bit more notes on that in a bit. The only open port on the device was the PulseStream dbus port. It's like port 16,883 or something like that. And I tried to connect to that using the Pulse Audio setup in Linux, but I didn't have any success. Potentially, it could be really fun if that works to connect into this device and take over its microphone or speaker. I'm not sure if that is possible or not, though. It has a PC application that, similar to the DROPCAM, mounts as a USB device. You can then run the application, and this sets up the initial camera configuration and pairing. When you load that, its very first connection goes over HTTP. The SIMPLICAM website then redirects you to HTTPS, but there's a little bit of a window there that an attacker might be able to do something. Otherwise, there was a whole bunch of magic values passed back and forth between the camera software and the camera. It looked super dubious to me, but I spent a few hours on it, couldn't figure out exactly what the structure was. So if someone wants to look at the binary and do some reversing on it, potentially there's some really interesting stuff there where you could convince a camera to repair or things like that, but we weren't able to specifically find how you could do that. In the client application, there was hard-coded API keys for their CLOSELI cloud services, as well as their Twitter account. They claim that those are fixed, so hopefully they are. Hopefully they changed them and didn't just remove them, because it's probably not too hard to find an old version of this app. They don't do certificate pinning, but on their mobile app, unlike their device, they did at least check certificates properly, so you couldn't just pass the self-sign one in. And instead of storing stuff in the keychain or anywhere else, they're just stored in the phone's file system, all the configuration tokens, snapshots, and so on. I think you'd still need physical access to someone's phone to be able to do anything with those, but they were there. For their cloud services, their website claimed that everything's fully encrypted and you're all good. But when we looked at it, video streams were just sent over plain HTTP. They claim that that's fixed as well. So that would be good to see. Otherwise, you know, you got a Wi-Fi camera, it's sending a video stream over plain HTTP. That's going to be pretty easy for people to intercept. And they offer cloud storage and playback of videos. So when we initially presented our findings, we presented them kind of as high-level findings. We, had a news release and so on. This was back in January or February. Kind of pointed out the high-level issues with these devices, but we didn't go into any of the technical specifics. And we got like a really angry response from them. Well, the reporters got a really angry response from them about how it's factually incorrect that they don't do certificate validation. And Synack's a company that has no credibility. We can't trust anything they say. And then 2 months ago, getting ready for this presentation, we sent in the technical details on the vulnerabilities we found, anything new we found, and kind of got like a generic response back about we're going to forward this along, and then heard nothing. And then a week and a half ago, get an email from them that says, hey, we just want to let you know we fixed all your findings. You said you're going to be presenting these sometime. Kind of tell us a bit about that. So we told them we would present it at DEF CON. And they said, oh, great. Like, we're really pleased we could work with you. We're going to put out a press release. And so, sorry. There's this like super positive press release on their website. You go look it up and they're like, Synack's awesome. We love this security community. We encourage this kind of stuff. So I don't know if it's like different people in the company or a change of heart or what, but they seem like super happy now. So that's good to see. So like I said in the previous slide, they've got the root password just in their config file. So I noticed that pretty quickly. Thought I had more notes on that. I guess not. The interesting thing with this right here is they've got something like a 16-digit root password, but it's hashed using the normal Unix DES. So only the first 8 characters of it are going to be used. And the first 8 characters are just all alphanumeric. All their symbols and stuff are at the end of the password. So conceivably, even if you didn't have this password, it wouldn't be too hard to crack. I just thought that was kind of funny. To get a console, just like the DROPCAM, you want to modify the AM boot arguments and drop to a shell. Otherwise, you can just use the hard-coded password. As far as we can tell, it's the same on every device. And there's the commands there. So next device we looked at was the WITHINGS baby monitor. I don't know if anyone here, probably not, DEF CON gets crazy, but there was a talk this morning from someone on hacking a whole bunch of baby monitors. So I was talking to, I think it was Mark, who gave that talk yesterday, or I was talking to him yesterday about his talk coming up this morning. And he looked at this device as well. So he's going to have a lot more details in his presentation. But here were like the main points that I covered. Basically, the huge issue with this device is it's got an SSH port open, and it's just got a fixed root password. So anyone that can get local network access can try and SSH into this device as root. The second huge issue is that it uses HTTP for all its communications, not HTTPS. So anyone can man in the middle all the communications. I looked for their GPL code because they're using like a modified version of U-boot, all kinds of GPL stuff. And their support department told me that they don't give that out. So someone should probably tell the GPL people. I don't know if anyone cares, but I thought that was funny. They don't have a PC application. Their Android application had this funny thing where they've got a user account coded into the application, and I think it uses it for initial registration. And it's got this like hilariously poorly obfuscated password, and it's like a valid account. You can log into their service with it. So we tried to tell them about all these vulnerabilities, and it just went to a black hole. So I don't know if they've fixed them. I don't think they have. They also have their GCM API key, the Google services, exposed in their Android app. So if anyone wants a copy of that to mess with them, it's there. For their cloud playback, they use RMTP, and how they generate those hashes looked a bit dubious. We didn't have time to immediately find any flaws with how they do it, but it seems conceivable that it's just based on the serial number or something like that. So it might be really easy to tap into people's streams. So I mentioned it has a fixed root password, but I spent a whole bunch of time and I was not able to crack the root password. I was both pleased and disappointed to hear that Mark hadn't been able to crack it either. So if there's like one password to crack at DEF CON, this is the one. Hack everyone's baby monitor. If you're wanting to get to a shell on this device and change that root password so you can log in over SSH, There's a serial header right on the front of it. This device is a huge pain to open up because it's got basically the circuit board is basically tied down with the Wi-Fi antennas. I don't know how they like put it together first, I guess maybe with glue. But it's a huge pain to disassemble everything, so you don't actually need to. You can just kind of half open it, and the connector's right on the front there, and get a serial console. All right, so I'm getting low on time, but a bunch of these devices I have less findings for, so it'll work out okay. The ECOBEE we looked at next was a thermostat. Its communications were quite well locked down. It did have a serial port, but overall was quite decently secure. Its Android app had no cert pinning, and the creds were stored in the keychain. And the cloud storage system had various settings and history configured, but it used HTTPS appropriately. And really, we didn't find any real issues with this device. It's got two different serial ports on it. One gets you backplate serial, is what they call it. It just gets you some of the more like readings and raw data from the device. Another one is what you can use to get an actual shell. It actually just boots right to a root shell, so you don't really have to do much. The only thing you need is a Torx T6 screwdriver to open the device up. And then this is the pinout. Since it's a thermostat, it runs off 24 volts AC when you want to power it. I somehow mixed up DC and AC when I was reading the specs on these. So when we get to the Lyric, I'll tell you a bit about that. But make sure you get an AC adapter, not a DC adapter. All right, the next device is the Hive. The Hive is a thermostat put out by British something, British Gas and Electric, British Gas. And so it's a thermostat and actually a few different devices that can connect to your heating system. And it's built on top of the alertme.com platform. We found that overall it had pretty good security. And we didn't actually have a ton of problems that we noted with it. It doesn't have a PC application as far as I know. The phone doesn't use cert pinning. And really the only thing that we noted with the mobile application is that some of its content's loaded over HTTP. It's less sensitive, but still might be an attack vector to the device. The communications to the cloud services were properly encrypted. The only interesting thing there is that this is kind of a generic service that several IoT devices are built on top of. So if you wanted to get some good bang for your buck for hacking one of these systems, that might be the one to look at. And when we're looking in the device itself, the config files and so on, there's a bunch of references to test instances. So as an attacker, that's like a great place to start. Stuff's probably not secured there. You'd probably pull down the whole file system, find some vulns, and then hack the production stuff. That's what I would do at least. And this device I believe, boots straight to shell. And if not, the root password was blank anyways. So I think it has a boot console that you can get into if you need to. Otherwise, just username root, no password. And it doesn't have an FCC ID because Britain doesn't believe in that. All right, next one, Honeywell Lyric. So Lyric is a thermostat as well. It's kind of a competitor to a Nest. It looks similar. I actually was like super disappointed in it. It feels like super flimsy and looks ugly. That's just my opinion. But I loved like the EcoBee way more and the Nest way more. This one was, I don't know, whatever. It runs a web server during its initial pairing. So it kind of acts as a Wi-Fi access point. Your phone connects to it, exchanges some data, and then it's configured. Its pairing web server uses HTTP, not HTTPS. And that was more or less the only real issue we found with this device. It doesn't run Linux, unlike all these other devices. As far as we can tell, it runs ExpressLogic, RTOS, most likely ThreadX, and basically was quite secure. Sorry. For the mobile device, it stores credentials in the keychain. But these credentials can also show up in log files if the app crashes. They basically configured it to log everything, and they didn't filter anything out. The only interesting thing from the cloud perspective is that it used static IPs to talk to their servers, as far as I can tell. So I don't know how you DDoS mitigate static IPs, but they might have some issues there. Otherwise, everything was properly encrypted. Only weather was transmitted in plain text. In this device, we found 3 different serial consoles. all of them just seemed to be debug messages. They didn't actually seem to be interactive consoles. So we found one, I think, for the radio, one for backplate information, and one for, it just seemed to be a more generic console. But like I said, I couldn't get any receive working on the device. I could transmit data to it, but I couldn't get any responses back. This one you need a Torx T6 to open up as well, but you don't actually really need to. The backplate connector on the thermostat itself has 8 extra pins compared to the wall plate. So as I suspected, those pins are actually wired out to a serial console, so you can just tap directly into those. The problem is figuring out how to power this device because the backplate has hardware circuitry in it as well. So if you just give this 24 volts AC, it still doesn't seem to power up. So maybe someone can find a better solution than me, but I basically just rammed wires through, plugged the pieces together, and still have my serial console going. So the next thermostat was the Nest thermostat. This one is Linux-based and has already been assessed quite a bit by other people. You can root it via USB. This should say some mystery UDP ports are open on the device. I'm not really sure what they're for, but overall it was quite secure from our few days of testing. The mobile application, basically everything's fine. It doesn't pin certificates, but that's not really a big issue. And for cloud communications, the only real issue is weather data. Oh, should have brought some water. So GTV Hacker put out a thing where you can root the device. We put our logo on it, did a bunch of things. There's some great tools. There's really interesting stuff in the file system. It's kind of a fun device to poke around with if you got one. We then looked at the Nest Protect. It's yet to be rooted. So, oh, here we go. Thank you. I'm almost done. It's yet to be rooted. It looks like it has a serial port, but we didn't get time to get that working. The real interesting thing with this device is it, during pairing, acts as a Wi-Fi access point and then uses this proprietary Nest Weave protocol, which I think has become Google Weave, to talk to your mobile app and do that pairing. And so that looked like really the main point that someone's going to want to mess with. We didn't get enough time to properly reverse engineer how that all took place. There's a pairing code that you send. It's only active for a short amount of time. So generally it seems quite reasonable, but we didn't root the device, so we had a hard time really getting access to the specifics. So here's some pictures of the internals. There's actually a great teardown on SparkFun. So really with that device, 4 days was not enough to root it, was our finding. Control4 HC-250. This is just a generic home theater controller. It's fairly old, but I guess widely used, one of the first ones out there. This device basically has no network level protections. So if you use the default root password, you can get access to it. Control4's response is basically make sure you firewall this device, then you'll be okay. The PC application and the mobile application really didn't have big problems. We didn't have a license to test all the functionality, but the stuff we looked at seemed all right. It does have some weird services running. It's got a web server. It's got this custom port that lets you tail any file you want as root. So security-wise, it's terrible from a network perspective, but its cloud and mobile communications seem fine. So basically the finding with this one is if you firewall it off, you're probably okay. But if you don't, it's a huge vulnerable system. The only other interesting thing is the serial console works, but you can't get to U-boot. They patched U-boot, so you can't access it. Next device we looked at was the Iris from Lowe's. This uses the Alert Me platform as well, just like the one from British Gas. It was overall quite secure, but you can get a serial shell on this quite easily. So I've got notes on that here. This is the last device I really want to talk a bit about, the REVOLV. So REVOLV got bought by Nest, I think. So I don't think you can buy a REVOLV anymore. But this device was just all kinds of amazing. It's like DEF CON went out and was like, we're going to build an Internet of Things device for people to CTF test. We're going to put some easy vulns in. We're going to put some medium vulns in. We're going to put some hard vulns in. That's this device. It's got like 1 million different radios on it. It's got 1 million different debug ports. It's got ports and services running like no tomorrow. That device probably spent a month testing it and still not be done. The REVOLV mobile application mostly used secure communications, but it has some API keys hard-coded, which I think can give you access to a bunch of things. It uses flashlight pulsing on your iOS phone, or your iPhone, yes, to basically like Morse code blink a pairing code to the device. It's super awesome, looks amazing, looks like it's having a seizure. I thought that was awesome. So long story short, if you can get your hands on one of these, it's like a ton of fun. They've got communications encrypted, but they wrote their own crazy like custom protocol and protocol handler in Java that runs on the device. The real like interesting thing with this is now though that Nest or Google or whoever bought REVOLV now owns all their stuff. If they support the device, that's great. We sent in a bunch of vulnerabilities, just went to a black hole. But conceivably, all these devices are still calling out to a cloud, and it's no longer REVOLV's cloud. It's whoever owns REVOLV. That got to be interesting for a few different reasons. This device has a hard-coded root password. CTF starts now. If anyone wants to, you don't have to buy this device. Go to this link, download the firmware, start looking at crazy vulns. You'll just be amazed. Yeah, sure. Yeah, take a picture or something. I'm gonna post all these like immediately after this, but you know, every minute counts in a CTF. Yeah, I don't have a note on it here, but basically the weird thing with this is that the device itself has this SSH backdoor, so their cloud service can say, "Hey, open up an SSH tunnel to the device," and basically REVOLV or whoever owns their cloud server has a direct access to your network from that. All right, I think this is the last device I have because I know I'm 10 minutes over time. SMARTTHINGS, it didn't have any obvious security serial console. Had some pins, but they didn't give a serial console. But it did have an obvious PIG programming interface. So I thought, hey, PIG programmers aren't too expensive. I'll grab one, dump the firmware that way. Connected it all up, and the software tells me, oh yeah, you've got a PIG firmware here, or a PIG chip here, but it's locked from reading the firmware. So that was pretty upsetting because pretty much no one locks the programming interfaces on their devices. It's just not something people do. There's no good reason they don't do it, but I just never see people do it. So I was displeased to see that SMARTTHINGS is doing things right. They had a telnet server that would just run on this device, which seemed super terrible. It needed a password to access, but it wasn't clear what that password was because we didn't have the firmware. So we reported this to them as an issue, and they were actually really good to work with. They said they fixed it. They said they want us to test the fix, but we haven't had time to yet. But they seem really on top of trying to do security right, so that's good to see. Someone else had found an issue that they don't verify their certificates for their communications, so they've patched that as well. In their mobile application, they had some API keys exposed, both for their own service and I forget what other service. I don't think it was Twitter, but some other cloud service out there. They claim to have fixed that. So once again, hopefully they changed those keys, didn't just remove them. But that was an issue that we reported and they have now fixed. Otherwise, their mobile application was basically fine. And so their communications protocol, they actually wrote their own custom protocol and then just wrapped it in SSL. So we didn't have time to finish reverse engineering this, but someone should because custom communication protocols never are done right the first time or the second time. So I soldered a bunch of wires on. I tried to dump like the flash chips and stuff too. Basically got nowhere on this device. Was upsetting, but we only had a week. So that's 14 devices in like 45 minutes. Well, probably an hour. I have tons more notes on all these devices, so if you're interested in any of them, get in contact. I'm going to post all the slides. I think they're actually already at that link, but I'll confirm after this. And we probably don't have time for questions, but I'll be around, so just come grab me, and I'd be happy to talk to any of you guys. Thank you.